Hi, I'm Isabella, the co-founder of CamelAI, an AI data analytics agent, and I'm here today with Andrew Thompson, the CEO of Components. Hi, Andrew. How's it
Uh,
going?
Good, thanks.
Why don't you give us a bit of an introduction to you and Components? What is Components and what's your vision of the future?
So Components is a media and analytics company that tries to make value intelligible. The idea being that we could see price, we can see other signals, but value, the reasons that people do things, the reason people buy things, the sort of set of relationships that comprise what makes something valuable is only made intelligible when you can sort of see everything at once. So we have both a publishing operation that is built on an ever-growing data infrastructure, and ideally we would like to not only scale up the publishing operation, but sell the analytics tool to interested parties down the line for whom existing analytics services don't really go beyond surface level trends.
Awesome. Very exciting. Great space to be in data analytics. I don't know if
Mhm.
you can tell, it's one of my favorites.
I had a have idea.
So let's talk a bit about the challenge that brought you to Camel AI. What specific pain point led you to seek a solution like Camel?
So when Components began strictly as a publisher, which took an arc over the course of 6 years, first as a personal project, now as a company, it was essentially me doing all of the analysis, all of the writing, which is a very, very kind of niche intersection to work at. Usually you have people who can write, you can have people who can analyze data, you can have data engineers, and finding a co-founder who does all of those things is very, very, very difficult. So as we decided to incorporate and scale up the publishing from, a project that published once a year to something that was once a week or once a day, the question became, how would the other people who have contributed over the years be able to undergo the same process that I had the entire time? Because I think a lot of makes Components what it is that sort of singular process of working with the data and understanding the data kind of simultaneously rather than having data that's handed to you that you interpret by somebody else. And so very early on, we made this decision that this was a key use case of AI for our whole workflow, rather than having me do the analysis or having some other party do it, and then having one of our other members write about it, that if we used something like Camel, and we had been looking for this before we found Camel, that we could essentially transpose that niche intersection of abilities to kind of anyone. And it is worked out really, really well. I also think that what brought us to Camel, and I think just to text to SQL technologies general, is that since the idea of components is that nothing exists in isolation, and to understand anything, you kind of have to understand everything. Our infrastructure is made up of just, table after table after table across a lot of industries, a lot of domains, and traversing those tables with a manually written SQL query is just sort of a form of like he enjoys it. It's the kind of thing that I think a lot of people have been waiting for AI to replace, which is obviously not true of a lot of AI's use cases, but I think this is one of them. And watching not only just the ability to allow people who couldn't do a data analysis to now do it, but to sort of iterate through these exploratory questions of the data at a rate that's 20 times faster has just been a kind of modal shift for us.
Amazing. Yeah, democratizing SQL. That's one of the reasons we started working on Camel AI. Great answer. Great to know. Very interesting. So, next question. What types of questions do you typically ask Camel, or does your team typically ask Camel? And are there any insights now accessible through Camel that previously were not addressable?
I don't know. I mean, it's hard to separate the accessibility from the scale. So, you know, sometimes you have things that are basically the same, but somehow completely different. I think of Philadelphia and New York as a version of this, where kind of on certain levels they're the same, but the scale of New York is of such a greater magnitude that it renders it an entirely different place. And I think similarly, the ability to completely reduce the cognitive load, if not completely, then at least by, 90% of the analytics process, to shift all of that load to the data engineering, to its structuring, to its acquisition, to every other kind of ingredient within the infrastructure. and to be able to iterate through questions that you would otherwise be, basically sort of stitching together spaghetti code in a Jupyter notebook to do. It's hard to say if it's not like what's in Camel is a new kind of query language that asks a new question that no one could ask before, but simply the ability to ask questions at such a higher rate makes, I think, these more arcane things, these really, really projects that would have taken, 6 months to do, the fact that you can now do them in, or, 2 weeks or whatever it is, just makes that sort of final result more accessible. And so, um, I know maybe I'm not giving like a very kind of concise answer to this, but I think the accessibility just kind of has to do with the scale and the magnitude in which it exists.
Yeah, no, I think that's a perfect answer. I mean, it's kind of like that's not the value that you see addressing questions that you couldn't before. You could, but now everyone can, and everyone can do it significantly faster. And to go back to the first part of that question, so what kinds of questions are you and your teammates asking?
So we will ask, we just did this, we just published this analysis on Substack, and what we had in the actual data was just structured data on kind of individual Substack publications, models, estimated counts based on, models that I had built and so on. What I ended up doing with Camel was having it do write the tricky query for aggregating all of this and turning it into a histogram to look at Substack's entire business. And so I think that one of the things that it's good at is being able to handle these sort of large singular queries very well. But I also think that it's been very good at if you have data from, the St. Louis Federal Reserve that is tracking commodity prices across, whatever, hundreds of different commodities, and you also have data on housing costs and you have whatever it could be, it's been really, really great at traversing all of this and kind of searching through it in a way that prevents you from having to remember exactly what's in your data all the time. And I think that obviously, one of the most hellish parts of SQL queries is these really tricky joins. And so the ability to easily do joins has been something that, because of its ease, I think we are just able to do more of than we otherwise would.
Okay, that's really, really awesome. And I'll link the Substack launch post of components somewhere on the screen during this point of the call. It's a really awesome post. I encourage anybody listening to give it a read. Great. So let's talk a little bit about setup. How was the integration and kind of getting started process with Camel?
It was really easy. I think you guys have handled that really well. There were no bugs. There were no errors. I mean, I have nothing to say about it except that it worked and just sort of created a direct line to our database.
What
So
database is that?
a Postgres.
Postgres. Cool.
Yeah. Um,
Awesome.
so yeah, so it was, it's funny, we're dealing with another problem right now where this is made harder than it should be. And so I have, on more than one occasion encountered different forms of this integration or this connection. And I don't know, you guys did it well. So well done.
Yeah, that's all. Shout out to Miguel and Ileana.
Yeah.
That's all them. Okay. So, a little bit about trust and accuracy. How do you ensure that Camel understands your data and then provides reliable answers?
There's always, I think with data analysis, there are, a couple ways of doing this. One is that if you get something that is clearly like an analysis should always, there's kind of a margin in which it should and shouldn't surprise you. So if you get a completely shocking answer that makes no sense, whether it's with Camel or whether you're doing this manually in Jupyter or Studio, something is off. So first of all, there's always just the instinct of analysis, or the analytical instinct, I should say. Secondly, it's not hard to, I mean, even though writing the SQL queries is arduous and undesirable and hellacious, reading the SQL queries is obviously less so. And it's not super, it doesn't take a lot to sort of skim what it did to figure out if it did something wrong, if it limited something by the wrong date, um, or if it's, reading the wrong column or whatever. And I think that we're also pretty rigorous about making sure that, things are correctly commented on, that, the knowledge base is full of enough instructions that it tends to actually not we tend to like not really have these problems. But what I've typically found is that usually if it gets something wrong, it has to do with something on our end. It has to do with a, mismatched type during a migration of some kind. It has to do with there being a duplicate column that was accidentally left in after it shouldn't have been. So I do think that when it comes to something like writing SQL, I think that AI is really smart.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, so I would say 9 times out of 10, when I've seen something wrong in Camel, it has been because there's some part of our pipeline that needs to be fixed.
Okay, super interesting. So trust but verify, and it helps that you know SQL, you can read it, and you know the data set really well.
Right. And also, if any of
Awesome.
our writers are, given Camel, obviously one of us who knows SQL is always auditing that for accuracy.
Awesome. Good. I like it. Comparative value. How does
hmm
Camel AI compare to previous solutions that you've tried?
Well, the only other solution we tried was a Jupyter notebook. So I don't know. I mean, before we used Camel, we had sort of worked up a kind of makeshift, just terminal-based text to SQL tool that was there's obviously, getting the first 60% or 70% is easy, and it's getting the remaining 30% that makes all the difference. I think that obviously compared to the thing that we spent just like a couple weeks on putting it together in a terminal, it's vastly superior. But I also don't know, to be honest, I don't know much about the players in this space. Like, we started using you guys because of the Hacker News post. We like you. You've been really helpful. It works. And so, we like Camel. But whether there's some capability that others offer, I don't really know. And it's because I think we've been so focused on building everything else out that we haven't really had to. It hasn't been an imperative to really even do the comparison.
Good. I think that's definitely our goal. It works well and you like working with us and now you can just focus on building components.
Yeah.
Okay, so in general, would you recommend Camel to other users?
Yeah. I mean, I think I have.
Oh, cool.
I'm trying to think of who they were, but I've certainly told everyone about it. And when I talk about what we're doing. So yeah, not even really a hypothetical yes.
Thank you. That's so nice to hear. Okay. Thank you so much for your time, Andrew. This has been a great conversation, and I really appreciate you answering all of my questions today.
Thank you so much.